Northern Margo, you're a senior counsel, a past president of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies and the New Israel Fund Australia. In your native South Africa, you were an anti-apartheid student leader. You received the 2010 Community Relations Commission's Community Service Award for facilitating constructive discussions on a range of human rights and social justice issues. So that's a little bit about you, Robin. So you're coming to talk at Limmud Oz. What are you planning to tell us at Limmud Oz? What's your presentation going to be about?
Well, thanks for interviewing me, David. 3 human rights organizations have recently used the apartheid word in major reports. One was Yesh Din in the middle of last year. The second was B'Tselem in January this year. Both of those are registered not-for-profits in Israel, and both have a long record of human rights work in Israel. They know a lot about what's happening on the ground, especially in the occupied Palestinian territories. And then Human Rights Watch came out this year with a massive 213-page report, also using the A word. There are differences between the 3 reports. Yesh Din confined its use of that word to the West Bank. And that's the opinion that I found most interesting and useful. But B'Tselem went further and spoke about apartheid-type regime right across the area from the Jordan to the sea. And Human Rights Watch also confined its opinion to the occupied territories, but it included East Jerusalem. And what struck me was that there were furious reactions. I mean, the word apartheid is very loaded term, extremely loaded, because of its origins in the South African apartheid system. But I think some of the reactions in Australia went over the top. And for example, B'Tselem was described by one commentator as anti-Semitic for having used the word to criticize Israeli policy. I find that completely unreasonable. You may not agree with B'Tselem, and in fact, I have reservations about the position they've adopted. I'm not sure that they got the convention requirements and the Rome Statute requirements exactly right, but they know what they're talking about on the ground, and they're trying to sound a warning. Yesh Din opinion is written by Michael Sfard. It's a legal opinion by an Israeli advocate who appeared before the High Court, who's a huge experience on human rights issues. And whatever you think of it, it's a properly argued legal opinion in my view. The Human Rights Watch report is much bigger, and Human Rights Watch is an American-based organization, but it has been very critical in the past also of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. In 2018, they issued a damning report about arrest, torture, and repression by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. So they have not been just anti-Israel, as some commentators suggested. And what struck me was that at least 4 Israeli prime ministers warned, starting immediately after the Six-Day War, of the risk of an apartheid structure growing or developing in the occupied territories, unless Israel took steps to avoid that. And these organizations, in my opinion, I know it's not shared by everyone at all, but are already just picking up on that warning. No court has applied the new definitions of apartheid. Well, that's another point I want to make in my presentation. Apartheid, as now defined in international law, is not the same as apartheid in South Africa. It has no necessary connection with apartheid South Africa. And it also has no necessary connection with any racist ideology. And as Yesh Din, for example, points out, what's happened in the West Bank is the settlement project. If Israel was a temporary occupier, it has every right under international law to suspend the civil rights of the population of the occupied territory until there's a resolution. And for many years, that was Israel's alibi, that one day there'll be an agreement and the disputed territories will be properly settled and allocated. But meantime, the settlement project has continued. There are now 440,000 odd Jewish Israeli settlers in the West Bank, 14% of the population, and Israel's been making all sorts of changes, some of which are intended to be irreversible, on land, structure, etc., etc., etc. And the excuse, which is always given for this development, is security, and there are undoubted security reasons for some of Israel's actions in the West Bank, but a lot of them, and this is the Din opinion goes into considerable detail, and so do Human Rights Watch, but B'Tselem less so, but in the same area. A lot of what's happened in the West Bank has got no security justification. It's just not necessary for security, or it's not permitted under international law. Now, I know that Israel denies there's any occupation, but it has always said that it's temporary. What's happening in the West Bank is temporary. There'll be an agreement, and when the Palestinians sit down, they'll solve it. But things are happening on the ground, and I think we should take these warnings seriously. Whether they're right or wrong, Yesh Din have presented a properly argued opinion, and I think the way that it's in Israel's interest to address the opinion, not simply to label them as Israel haters. I mean, they've got people on their public council, like a former Knesset Vice President, Naomi Chazan, like Yehuda Karp, a former Deputy Attorney General of Israel. But B'Tselem's had A.B. Yehoshua, David Grossman, until his death, Amos Oz, professors from Israeli universities. None of them are Israel haters or anti-Semites. One can disagree with their views, but the way to do that, in my opinion, is to address the detail of the arguments they advance. And that's the purpose of my presentation. I'm not an expert on this area of international law, but I think it's in Israel's interest, and the interest of Jews everywhere, to take these arguments seriously and to address them on their merits.
So I think you've kind of told us why you picked this topic. I think you want to give this subject a bit of an airing because it's of such concern, as you've been just telling us. Just to give us a bit of indication, do you believe that these accusations of apartheid, and I would see that from what you've just been saying, you need to separate the accusations that lumber Israel proper into the accusation with those that separate it out and be just looking at the territories. Do you think they're actually based in fact, or are they just very often an attempt to slander and delegitimize the state of Israel?
There are plenty of people who want to slander and delegitimize Israel who are not bona fide. When two Israeli human rights organizations with a record of work on the ground, who are rooted in Israel, recognized by the Israeli government, present opinions, it's just nonsense in my view, and unproductive and dangerous to label them anti-Semitic or just Israel haters. I don't believe that's the case. If you disagree with them, address their arguments. The Yesh Din opinion, which is the one that's most familiar in format to me as a former senior counsel, former barrister, is very careful in the way it expresses itself. No court has decided these issues. The modern definition of apartheid in international law hasn't been tested in any court yet, so they are opinions. But if you want to counter them, you have to address the opinions and the arguments. That's what I want to say in my presentation.
Yeah, I want to be clear that I think that anybody who accuses Israel proper of being an apartheid state really needs to examine their thinking, because of I think one can't argue with the fact that Arabs in Israeli society are better off than any Arabs living in any other state, any other Arab state in the Middle East.
Yeah, I don't know a great deal about it in detail about other states, but obviously there are huge dissimilarities between Israel within the Green Line and apartheid South Africa. And we've just seen last night an Arab party signing a coalition agreement. Bennett appeared.
Yeah, we've certainly seen some major moves happening out of Israel in just the last 24 hours. That's for sure. I notice, Robin, that you've been also offered another opportunity to express your views at Limmud Oz. You're not just talking about the A word, which I may have mistaken to be about anti-Semitism when I first heard the subject, but you're on a panel of 8 people that's talking about the topic. You can't ask that, Jews and Palestinians. Now, this may even be more controversial than your presentation. Now, along the lines of Q&A, we see a panel here that's stacked with 4 presenters of Palestinian descent, 2 presenters who are linked to Jewish Voices for Peace, who are considered, I would say, by a majority of mainstream Jewish community to be pariahs, and yourself, a member of the New Israel Fund, which just leaves one person, Cherie Wax, as the only one who might claim any semblance to pro-Israel advocacy. Now, Hamish MacDonald from Q&A probably would be admiring how this panel has been stacked, because he did such a job in himself in stacking the panel on the Q&A that we both know what I'm talking about, that was on last week. So what do you make of this particular panel? I know it's going to be fascinating to listen to, but hasn't it really been set up in a very imbalanced way?
David, Jewish Voices for Peace, New South Wales, has no connection whatever with Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States. I think you may have assumed that they were connected. It's been going for 20 odd years. It's well respected in the New South Wales Jewish community. Cherie Wax is also a member of Jewish Voices for Peace. This group, Partners for Peace, is an attempt to maintain contact on a human level between Jews who support Israel and Palestinians who have been dispossessed in one way or another. And it's been very, very difficult to keep the group going, but I think it's extremely important. Daniel Bartel, Israeli professor, has written a book about the structure of our narratives. All groups develop a hegemonic narrative in times of conflict that strengthens the group, that unites it, that comforts it, and that demonizes the other. And we believe that ultimately there has to be some recognition of Palestinian rights and collective rights, as well as Jewish rights. And that's what the purpose of the conversation is. And there's no attempt to stack. The Jews in the group don't give up their narrative. I certainly haven't. I regard myself as a liberal Zionist. That's a term of abuse in some leftist circles. And the Palestinians, for their part, attempt to understand the Jewish narrative, but they don't always agree with it. They often don't agree with it. And during the recent conflict, of course, as you would imagine, there are lots of tensions. But the group put out a statement, perhaps you could look for it, about what we're on about. If it's a statement issued on the 25th of May. And what it seeks is a just future for both Jews and others.
Yes, well, I know that many people can make statements where they profess these kinds of views that we want a just settlement and so forth. I think very much of the time this is wishful thinking, and it's not based in hard realities of what's on the ground. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more from you and this panel at Limmud Oz. Thanks for giving us a bit of a taste of what to expect, and in a couple of weeks' time we can delve into it in great detail, and I encourage people to get involved. I think engagement on these subjects is the best thing. I really shun the views of people who are on the other side that won't talk to people like myself. I should show you the contemptuous response I got from Randa Abdul Fattah to my invitation to come and talk to me. It is really an attitude that I find very disappointing, that people, particularly on the left, just simply look at you and say, you've got this set of views, or surmise as to what your views are, and then they decide, well, I'm not going to talk to you because you're not going to be sympathetic to my point of view.
I agree completely, and I appreciate very much that you took the trouble to interview me.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Bye.
Bye.